The scripture this morning is from Luke 10, verses 29 to 37. A lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan traveling came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise."
These are words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated. We are blessed this morning to hear from Reverend Stephanie Escher. Stephanie is a hospice chaplain, and we thought that of people who can speak to us of mercy, Stephanie is right up there, so welcome.
I'm a little taller than my friends. So in the word this week that is sent out about what we're going to speak about in each service, they had written, and I think you had found the quote from Cynthia Bourgeau, is that correct, on mercy? So this is a little bit of what went out in the word this week, and I want to share it with you because it's how I based my stories that I want to share. So this is Cynthia Bourgeau. She says, when we think of mercy, we should be thinking first and foremost of a bond, an infallible link of love that holds the created and uncreated realms together. It is literally the force that holds everything in existence, the gravitational field in which we live and move and have our being. She has another quote that I pulled. I went and read her stuff because I'm a researcher. And I read her stuff, and this is the one I particularly wish to focus on today. Mercy is God's innermost being turned outward to sustain the visible and created world in unbreakable love. Let me read that one more time. Mercy is God's innermost being turned outward to sustain the visible and created world in unbreakable love. So I have a few stories I'd like to share with you about this unbreakable love in the midst of unspeakable trauma, unspeakable sadness, unspeakable loss. The first story, I was called into a room in the intensive care unit. I was called in to consult because the care staff was worried because the woman was agitated and she kept pulling out her IV. And they put it back in and she kept pulling it out. And so they wanted me just to go talk with her and see if I couldn't help in some way. So I walk into the room, and many of you have been in ICU rooms, right? And you're hooked into machines, and there are tubes, and there are things going in and things going out. It tends to be a bit of a strange space to be in. So I approached her, and I talked to her, and I said I was called in because she was agitated. And she looked at me, and she said, "Oh, are you going to poke me?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm actually a chaplain. I try not to poke." But I asked her about what was going on, and she said, you know, the thing is, she said, I am so tired. She said, I sleep here because they give me all kinds of drugs, but I am tired. I cannot rest. So we talked a little bit more about that. She also talked about, she knew that she was nearing the end, right? That she wasn't much long for here on this earth. And she actually said that she was okay with that. She'd had a good life, and she talked about feeling, anyway, she said that she was okay with dying, that she knew that she would be with God. Her biggest fear is, and this is the fear I hear a lot from people, it's not so much dying, it's the process of dying. And so that's what she was scared of. And she said her biggest thing was that she felt alone. And we talked about it, and she said she had outlived her family. Her husband she had buried some years ago. Of course, her parents, they didn't have children. Her brothers and sisters, everybody was gone. And she said she was just lying in this room, and she couldn't rest, and she felt alone. And so I sat down next to her, and I just started to ask her questions. And I asked, you know, where'd you grow up? What was it like where you lived? And she was on a farm, so we talked about the farm. We talked about her mom, memories that she had, moments when she was afraid when she was a kid that her mom would hold her. We talked about the fresh baked bread and that smell. We talked about her growing up and her siblings and arguments they'd have, and the more we talked, the more animated she became, and it's like the room became alive. She talked about her husband and how they met. And by the end of the time together, her eyes were getting a little bit heavy. And she started to look around the room, and I have to tell you, I felt it, and this happens a lot with people. The room was full. As she had talked about each person, you know, we talk about that all the time here, that thin space. It became thinner and thinner, and she was surrounded. And as she talked about her mother and her father and her siblings and her husband and her friends and her playmates, they entered the room. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, but I know she could see them. And she looked around, and there was this comfort, and there was this experience of great love. And she wasn't alone, and she closed her eyes and she rested. God, in your mercy. My second story is I went to the home of a woman who was in her 50s, and she was dying of cancer. And she didn't have long to live. Her biggest concern was her youngest son. He was in his early 20s, and he was developmentally disabled. And he had been living with her. And she was concerned most for him. She had planned for his housing. He was going to be able to stay in the house with other family members. But she said she was just worried that he would be lost without her. So she passed a couple weeks later, and I had the privilege of doing her memorial service. And I got to the space where we were going to hold it, and I ran into her youngest son, and he looked lost. He was just standing there, and he was surrounded by people, but he looked so very lost. So I thought about it, and then I asked him, I said, listen, I have this part in the service where I need some help. Would you help me? If I called your name, would you come up? And he said, yes, I would. So he came up. There was one point in the service I called him up, and we were going to have people come up and share prayers and blessings by tying ribbons to something that we had arranged in front. And so I called him up, and we were standing there, and so people came, and they were invited as they wished. No sharing out loud, just coming up and sharing and tying a ribbon. So people came up, and it ended up being very lovely because they would also approach the son, and they would, give him a hug. They'd say they were sorry for his loss. They would touch him in some way and include him. But the best moment of all is when I looked back, and up stood a group of young people, and they were his team from Special Olympics, and they were in full uniform. And they had come to be with their teammate. And they came up, and I looked at him, and his eyes just lit up. And they came up, and they tied on they tied on the ribbons, and then each one again would go up to him and they'd give him a big bear hug and they'd say, I love you, I'm so sorry, I love you. But the best part was after they each talked to him, they gathered around him in a huddle of sorts. And I heard them say, you know what, no matter what, we're your team. We're your team. God, in your mercy. This last week, I was seeing another hospice patient, a woman in her 60s, who was dying, and she had just been brought home from the hospital. And I have to tell you this, even though there was someone in this place that was dying, the house was filled with so much life. There was soup on the stove and you could smell it. She was surrounded by women. She had been a midwife for years, and she had daughters and a granddaughter, and they were all there caring for her, and there were animals. And they had put her in the back room in her bedroom, and she had done an advanced care plan, and she didn't want any great things. She didn't want oxygen. She wanted comfort. She wanted peace. She wanted to be surrounded by her loved ones in her own room. So they had her favorite quilt on her bed. They had fresh flowers. She had requested fresh flowers. There was a bowl of fresh fruit next to her. It was sunshine. The windows it was sunny, and there were just these sheer curtains, and it was a place, and there were angel wings above her bed. And it was this place of great peace and love. And so her daughters, her young adult daughters, were sitting with her, and they said that they had been keeping vigil. And they'd get nervous sometimes because they were afraid that she would go, and they wouldn't be there if she'd go, right? So they'd watch her neck and see if she was breathing. And they talked about how much they loved her, and they said, this is this woman who's brought so much life into the world, and she had delivered one of their own babies. And they said that when they had asked their mom how many babies she had delivered, she said she stopped counting at 1,300. So they said they were getting letters and Facebook messages and texts from around the world from people who said, you know what, she's our mom, she was our midwife, and we're with her, and we are surrounding her in love. And one of the young women was about to get married in about 3 or 4 months, and she was sad because her mother wouldn't be there, to be with her in that moment. And they talked a bit about feeling orphaned, which they said seems silly, right? We're grown-ups, but we feel we're going to lose our mom, But then they told me they had this experience. So since their mother was a midwife, she had this great community of women. And she said they called them their aunts. These women who would come in, and it was almost a village, and they helped care for each other's children. It was this beautiful group of people walking through life together. And so the day after they brought their mom home from the hospital to die, it was that next morning, and they had been up all night, and they were exhausted. They said they got a phone call, and it was from one of their aunts. And she said, we visited you last night, and all I'm going to say is look out your window. So they said they got up, and they looked out their windows, and all around in the front yard and the backyard were snow angels. As many snow angels as could possibly fit, and they were sprinkled with fresh flower petals. God, in your mercy. Amen.